Forests, where people died in their thousands, not from war or from natural disaster. They were the innocent victims of the state, branded as enemies of the people, shot and tossed into pits.
И вот их привозили сюда и расстреливали так. Расстреливали НКВДисты у форме НКВД, расстреливали из наганов и расстреливали у потылицу. Подвозили по 2 человека до ямы, становили, с наганом у потылицу стреляли и спихивали в ямы. И так, покуль один штабель настреливали, коли машины кончались, пясочком засыпали, робили как слоеный пирог. Другую машину расстреливали. И так, покуль трупы не наполняли доверху.
Over 100,000 men and women were killed here between 1937 and 1941. And there are other forests like this one. Prison camps spread like a cancer across the land, the destination of tens of innocent millions. Most never returned.
Это была чистая жестокость, которая шла иногда во вред государству, во вред обществу, во вред самой системе, созданной Сталиным. И я сталкивался с таким проявлением жестокости, что привыкнуть к этому было совершенно почти невозможно.
A country gripped by fear, dreading the knock on the door at night and the secret whispering of informers, like Valentin Astrov.
Народу-то я не изменял ведь тому, когда это делал, потому что весь народ так думал. А по существу, конечно, изменял, получается. Сейчас я вижу, и это мучительно очень.
And yet there was also victory in the war, an ideology which fathered an empire. In just 30 years, a backward peasant country became a world power. The master of the triumph and the terror was a beloved hero to his people.
Для нас было, знаете, что-то такое. Как я маленькая думала, Бог и Сталин что-то одно и то же.
When he died, they wept. Even in the prison camps, they wept, as Lev Kopelev recalls.
Когда его хранили и гудели гудки, я зашел в пустой барак, там, где никого не было, чтобы не видели ни товарищи заключенные, ни охрана, чтобы не думали, и плакал.
The country is still burdened by his legacy. How can we understand what happened in his time? Where does the responsibility lie? With him? With those who went along with him? Or with those who went before? He wasn't a Russian. He was born in Georgia in 1879. Georgia was then part of the empire of the Tsars of neighboring Russia. Centuries of invasion had bred in the Georgian people a hard streak of defiant nationalism. His real name was Joseph Jugashvili. He called himself Stalin, Man of Steel, later on. His birthplace was Gori, in the shadow of the Caucasus Mountains. It was then a town of 8,000 or 9,000 people. His statue still dominates the main square. Attempts to pull it down were fiercely resisted by locals. His home, enshrined beneath a grandiose canopy in the 1930s, attracts many visitors. He still has his devoted admirers.
Stalin იყო იქნება და არის ამჟამად ჩემში, როგორც ის იყო შრომელი ხალხის ინტერესების დამცველი. მეორე მსოფლიო ომს თუ სტალინი იქნებოდა, ვერ მოვიგებდით ჩვენ. სტალინი იყო დიდი გენია, ის იყო ბელადი, ლენინის გამგრძელებელი.
It was, in fact, a rented hovel, less homely and well-scrubbed than it looks now. Joseph was the only surviving child. His mother, Ekaterina, was a peasant. Her husband, Vissarion, was a cobbler. It's not certain if he really was Joseph's father. This photograph may have been faked later to lend legitimacy to Stalin's parentage.
It was rather horrid childhood of poverty, with a father who was a drunk, who used to beat the rest of the household, mother and himself, and the boy, when he grew up a little bit into teenage, he used to protect mother, and one time even threw the knife at his father in protecting, so it was pretty wild, and then he had to run away and was hit by the neighbors from the furious father. It was pretty rough.
Young Joseph caught smallpox, scarring his face for life. His left arm was partially withered. He was small, wiry, and excellent at lessons. The tough, gory street urchin never sympathized with the underdog. As a school friend later recalled, to gain a victory and be feared was triumph for him. He was a good friend so long as one submitted to his imperious will. When he was 14, Joseph's devout mother sent him to study for the priesthood in the Georgian capital, Tbilisi. In the seminary, all teaching was in Russian. Discipline was repressive. Revolutionary politics flourished among the students. Joseph was introduced to a host of forbidden books. In secret, he read Darwin, Karl Marx, and Lenin's earliest pamphlets. They channeled Joseph's growing defiance against authority and fired his ambition. He left the seminary at 19 to become a revolutionary.
Most of the young men in Tbilisi and Georgia in those years were becoming radicals of one kind or another, and Marxism was very much in the air. And some of them were becoming Marxists of a soft character, and others were becoming very hardline Marxists. And he gravitated to the wing of those who were the most hardline. At the time that he became a Marxist, I don't believe that it meant that he was moving away from being a Georgian, because many Georgians were becoming Marxists, and it wasn't an anti-Georgian thing to be doing at that time. Later on, when he gravitated into the orbit of Lenin, then we can see him becoming more and more of a Russian in his self-consciousness. Stalin becomes a Russian, but that was not the initial response.
Stalin's first task was to preach revolution to the railway workers of Tbilisi. He went back in 1926 and acknowledged his debt to one of the workers in particular, Georgy Sturua. Sturua introduced Stalin to the organized workers, as his son remembers.
Stalin lacked practical knowledge of proletariat, how the working class lives. So his knowledge was very much bookish. He read Marx, read Engels, read other social democrats, but he wanted also to connect his theoretical knowledge with the practical life of the working class, to whom he wanted to dedicate his career.
Not all the workers applauded him in 1926. Similarly, a quarter of a century before, he had aroused dislike among some of the Georgian Marxists. They found him power-hungry and disruptive. He moved on to agitate among the workers in Batumi. In 1902, Stalin married Ekaterina Svanidze. She died young. At her funeral, Stalin told a friend that she had softened his heart of stone. With her died my last warm feelings for people. In Batumi, Stalin entered a world of secret printing presses for revolutionary publications. Inevitably, the Tsarist secret police caught up with him. He was arrested and imprisoned in 1902 for the first of many times. Described in police files as active and very serious, extremely conspiratorial, he was also associated with the robbing of banks, a regular practice among revolutionaries in the Caucasus to raise funds.
These people were involved in all kind of dangerous things, and bank robberies, yes. Bank robberies, yes. I don't know personally or not, but that was part of getting means for revolution, as it would be put. He was believed to be one of those practical workers of revolution.
There are more damaging allegations that on occasion Stalin informed on people to the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police itself.
Так что очень много моментов указывает на то, что Сталин был в особых отношениях с царской охранкой. Особенно, когда ему хотелось отомстить кому-то. Так что хоть периодически, но он мог предавать и предавал людей, хотя вряд ли систематически, непрерывно работал. Вряд ли.
Doubt and mistrust followed him into Siberian exile. His relations with other exiled revolutionaries were strained. He had their respect, but shunned their friendship. They found him aloof and proud. Stalin escaped from exile in 1904, making his way over 3,000 miles back to Georgia, a pattern to be repeated a further 5 times. Defeat of Tsarist rule in Russia dominated Stalin's thinking. Lenin held the key. Lenin was then a wanted man in European exile. He combined a genius for applying theory to practice with a heroic vision of an organization of revolutionaries overturning Russia. The organization was Lenin's Bolshevik Party. To rise up its hierarchy, Stalin journeyed illegally to party conferences in Europe. Lenin was impressed with Stalin and co-opted him onto the party's central committee. He was sent back to Russia, one of 4 men in charge of party activities there. The people the Bolsheviks sought to rally were the urban factory workers.
Мы угнетенные были. Мы видели, кто живет хорошо очень, кто плохо живет, а кто совсем нищенствует. Была резкая грань между, так сказать, бедным и между остальными, не говоря уже о капиталистах.
It was a working life of long hours and low wages. If they broke the rules, they were fined, or worse.
За малейшую какую-то провинность, которую мы не чувствовали, обязательно или пощечина, или ногой толкнут, или еще. Так же были тяжелые условия. И мы что-то хотели, мы что-то видели, но я четко, ясно себе не представлял.
Lenin realized that the task for the Bolshevik Party was to channel the discontent of the working classes and lead them towards eventual revolution. The right policies and circumstances would push them into the arms of the Bolsheviks. The Tsar had plunged the country into the First World War. The Russian army was poorly led and ill-equipped. By 1917, the dead, wounded and missing totaled 7 million. Morale was low and led to waves of desertion. There were considerable food shortages, since most of the soldiers were peasants. They wanted nothing more than to return to their farms and be given the right to own the land they worked. Peasant grievances, like those of the urban workers, were gathering to a head. February 1917. Petrograd, then the capital, was engulfed in demonstrations and strikes. Whole regiments mutinied, and Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. Power passed to the provisional government. Stalin reached Petrograd on March the 12th, ahead of Lenin and the others. He quickly took control of Pravda, the party newspaper. He was his own man, not shy of putting forward his own policies, even if they were in conflict with Lenin's.
I'm very proud to say that my father didn't vote for revolution then. He voted with others who thought, no, it wasn't the time. The fact which was wiped out from all textbooks later.
Lenin alone believed power was in their grasp. Ilya Shkarpa saw his return to Russia in April. He decided to join the Bolsheviks.
Я решил, что это человек, который поведет страну вперед и к благополучному окончанию войны. У меня отец был в это время на фронте, и я страстно желал, чтобы отец уцелел и вернулся с фронта. И Ленин это «Да здравствует мир, да здравствует социальная революция». Вот так.
Lenin grabbed Bolshevik policy with both hands. The slogans were peace, bread, land to the peasants. Power would pass to the Soviets or elected councils of workers, peasants and soldiers. By the end of October, the Bolsheviks seized power in a comparatively bloodless revolution. Stalin kept out of the limelight, editing Pravda and assisting Lenin. His earlier opposition to revolution wasn't held against him. When the Politburo was formed to direct party policy, Stalin was one of its 7 members. To hold on to power, Lenin made an arrangement with the peasants, 80% of the population. They agreed to support him in exchange for a share in government and a new decree to divide the land equally among them. Hopes still ran high. Prisoners were freed from jail. The death sentence was abolished. The Tsarist secret police was disbanded. The press would be free. Democracy became a possibility. The voting for a new parliament, the Constituent Assembly, had already taken place. But this put the peasants' parties well ahead of the Bolsheviks. Faced with loss of power in a bourgeois parliament, Lenin disbanded the Constituent Assembly. It was, he said, the complete and public liquidation of formal democracy in the name of the revolutionary dictatorship. It will be a good lesson.
Democracy was just born in Russia and sort of murdered in the crib by the October Revolution. Because what proceeded later was never a democracy, as we understand it, and was never a prosperity, and never brought to Russia anything what was promised.
In March 1918, the government moved to Moscow. Lenin pulled Russia out of the First World War, causing the peasant representatives in the cabinet to walk out. Russia was now a one-party state. The Bolsheviks were forced into a siege mentality. They were attacked by the wights, old supporters of the Tsar, by the West, who sent troops in, by new enemies and old friends. This was civil war. Leon Trotsky was military commander of the Bolshevik forces. He had masterminded with Lenin the seizure of power in the revolution and was the founder of the Red Army. Infighting between Stalin and Trotsky disrupted Bolshevik command during the Civil War. Stalin was in the government as Commissar of Nationalities and one of Lenin's right-hand men. He was eager to carve out a military role for himself to rival Trotsky's. It was the period known as war communism, with strict centralized control of manpower and resources. Crises were countered by ruthless decisions. This was Stalin's chance to extend his authority. In May 1918, Stalin was appointed director of food supplies in southern Russia. He went to Tsaritsyn on the Volga, then under heavy attack. Georgy Sturwa, his old mentor from Tbilisi, was bringing food from Astrakhan to Baku, then at famine point. Stalin arrested him and took all the food.
My father told Stalin, Joseph, you know that Baku is starving. They are my friends. And Stalin said, if Baku fails, the Soviets will survive. But if Tsaritsyn fails, the Soviet power will be destroyed. Well, he knew that Baku really was in desperate situation, but it didn't matter for him. And of course, it didn't matter for him to shoot 1 or 2 or 10 or 12 generals, old generals, white generals, or even his own comrades, if they were against him.
Nadezhda Alliluyeva worked in Lenin's secretariat. She and Stalin 1919. Her mother complained to Lenin about Stalin's character.
Lenin answered, this is her words, that, well, Olga Evgenievna, you know, Asiat, you know, he's an Asian, kind of Asiatic, we would say, ruthlessness.
Ruthlessness was the order of the day. Western troops executing Bolsheviks. In August 1918, there was an assassination attempt against Lenin himself and a failed coup in Moscow. Lenin's response, the Red Terror. He telegraphed Stalin, urging him to be merciless against their enemies. Stalin replied, "Our hand will not tremble." Within weeks of the revolution, the new state security agency, the Cheka, had been formed. Stalin was on the committee which supervised its activities. Lenin brought back press censorship and the death penalty. He turned the Cheka loose on the enemies of the revolution, proclaiming, "The state is an instrument for coercion. We want to organize violence in the name of the interests of the workers." They executed at least 50,000 during the Civil War. The Cheka was a temporary measure which became permanent. The next crisis was in the countryside. It overshadowed the Civil War, which by 1920 was largely won. The fighting had totally disrupted both farming and transport. The state requisitioned grain, and the harvest failed several years in succession. The combination was devastating, as famine forced the peasants from their villages. Some were driven to cannibalism. By 1921, 5 million men, women and children had died.
Ко мне пристали как коммунисту люди с такими вопросами. Что ты имеешь общее с этими разбойниками? Ты же ведь посмотри, как они к крестьянину относятся. Они вычищают из наших амбаров последнее зерно. Мы голодаем, и если вы так будете продолжать, я помню эти слова Кирилла Евсеевича Михальченко, моего соседа, то мы против вас восстанем.
The peasants did rise up, and even more were killed. With the whole country at breaking point, Lenin had to rethink. The peasants were the key. To entice them to produce freely, the communists would have to restore the market and some measure of capitalism. Lenin decided the party and the country had no option. The new economic policy was born.
There was no way of running this country anymore without making a big deal with the peasants. And the deal was, let's give them the dose of capitalism without which they cannot live. They'll keep us in power. That was the deal. That was the new economic policy.
Former British communist Harry Young was in Moscow and saw Lenin explain the compromise with capitalism to the party.
He was administering a bitter pill, and they had to take it. And he just very quietly said, "We can't go on like this any longer, comrades," in a very quiet, matter-of-fact, business-like way. Lenin spoke to the Congress like a Dutch uncle or like a granddad speaking to his wayward children. And there was a sort of a subdued hush when people realized that a major transformation had got to take place.
Lenin also banned all splits and factions in the party. It was, he said, no time to have an opposition. Much that was to go wrong later stemmed from this decision.
And I think it happened because of great fear that grew out of the terrible paradox that the Bolsheviks had won the Civil War and lost their support in the country at the very same moment. That the people that had put them in power, the working class, large segments of the intelligentsia, parts of the peasantry, had turned against the party because of the methods that the party had used to win the Civil War. The party was frightened. People said things like, the fate of the Soviet Republic hangs by a hair in 1921. And so the attempt to recast the party into a kind of fortress that could survive this moment came naturally after the Civil War. But it was, of course, nonsense. Nobody paid any attention to it until later, when it became a weapon for Stalin.
In 1922, Lenin approved Stalin's appointment as General Secretary of the Communist Party. It was a decisive moment in his career.
Сталин стал генсеком, генеральным секретарем еще при жизни Ленина. Ну, надо сказать, что тогда генсек это не был такая вот совершенно вот выдающаяся, что ли, всевластная фигура, какой он стал впоследствии. Это был генеральный секретарь. А почему согласились остальные на его кандидатуру? Именно потому, что никто не принимал его всерьез. Все считали, что это такая, ну, серенькая такая личность, которая ни для кого не представляет опасности.
Some backed Stalin for the job to avoid giving any more power to Trotsky. By 1922, Trotsky was perhaps the closest of the leaders to Lenin, and Lenin was ill. Stalin's attitude to Trotsky hardened even further. Lenin had one further task for Stalin. The Bolshevik state had not reached a satisfactory political settlement with a smaller nation, such as Georgia. Georgia had been running its own affairs since the revolution. In 1922, Lenin sent Stalin back there. He wanted Georgia brought tactfully into the fold. But Stalin had put his Georgian past behind him. He and fellow Georgian Orджоникидзе saw themselves as conquering Russians and descended on their homeland with a vengeance.
Вступление Красной армии в Грузию, аннексия Грузии, была в основном делом их рук. Они все время долго настаивали, они были инициаторами этого дела, и, как я уже сказал, Ленин уступил в конце концов. Как только вошли в Грузию, с первого же дня начались репрессии.
By late 1922, Lenin, increasingly frail and sick from a severe stroke, heard about Stalin's brutal handling of the Georgian nationality issue. He began to have grave doubts about Stalin, whom he'd supported so long and promoted so high.
In the Civil War, a powerful, ruthless organizer, unscrupulous, is the man to have. So this didn't look like anything particular during this period. Trotsky thought, or characterized many years later, Stalin as Lenin's chief of staff. He was a little bit more than that, but he also was this. So the ruthless elements in the man were just fitting for this atrocious period. Peace comes. A new economic policy emerges. Lenin lies there paralyzed, but still thinking and thinking beautifully about what's going on, and he stumbles upon things like the national questions and realizes that for the peacetime, this brutal guy is not the thing. Now he wants him out.
Limited in his power to change matters, Lenin committed his fears to paper in what became part of his testament. Stalin has, he said, unlimited authority. I am not sure whether he will always be capable of using that authority with sufficient caution. He is too rude, a defect intolerable in a general secretary. A way should be found to remove Stalin from that post. Lenin turned to Trotsky to help form a bloc against Stalin. He asked Trotsky to launch the attack at the forthcoming 12th Party Congress. But Lenin's two secretaries, Vatieva and Volodicheva, secretly passed on to Stalin Lenin's testament and his appeals to Trotsky. So Stalin arrived fully prepared for the Congress in 1923. It was the first Congress without Lenin, too ill to attend. But Trotsky did not defend the Georgians, nor did he attack Stalin. He'd done a deal with Stalin and the others. The deal was he could present his own economic program as long as he kept quiet about Stalin and the Georgian issue. A key opportunity to halt Stalin's progress was lost. And then, on the 21st of January, 1924, Lenin died. The loss was felt far beyond the party.
Многомиллионный город Москва, было такое впечатление, как будто вообще дома, наверное, по домам, наверное, никого нету. Все стоят в этой очереди. И костры эти. Вот это было настоящее горе народное.
Grief was accompanied by great anxiety. What would the future bring? Who would rule Russia?
А сзади колонного зала была комнатка, где сидели в скорбном молчании и переживали эту смерть. Конечно, трудно было предвидеть, что будет после смерти Ленина. Но вот у меня сейчас такое ощущение, что они как-то были потерянные.
In his testament, Lenin had seemed to argue for a collective leadership. He'd passed the testament to his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, to open after his death. Stalin, of course, had read it and knew it contained Lenin's advice to have him removed from office. He'd had time to plan his strategy. The cult of Lenin started immediately. He'd left no instructions about the disposal of his body. Stalin was one of those who argued successfully that Lenin's body should be embalmed. The party needed to find its way. The image of the dead leader would act as a beacon, in spite of the wishes of his widow.
Надежда Константиновна Крупская считала, что не должно быть культа Владимира Ильича Ленина, что сам Ленин не любил никакой торжественности, помпезности, никакого, понимаете ли, поклонения. Он бы этого не потерпел.
The views of the family didn't matter. The needs of the party were paramount. Stalin was quick to see how the cult of Lenin could benefit his own rise to power. From his very first speech after Lenin's death, Stalin aligned himself as closely as possible to the dead leader.
There's a political aim in Stalin's linking himself with Lenin and linking all his policy positions with Lenin and calling them Leninist rather than Stalinist, never using the word Stalinist. But he was only doing what his rivals were doing at the same time. Each was presenting his own platform as the platform dictated by Lenin and by Leninism, except that he was more successful at it than any of the others.
Stalin was now the junior member of a collective leadership. The two senior figures were Lenin's old colleagues, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. Leon Trotsky was slipping from the top, while the popular young party theoretician Nikolai Bukharin was still a rising star. Before he could climb the Bolshevik hierarchy, Stalin first had to defuse the time bomb contained in Lenin's testament, that he should be removed from office as General Secretary. Lenin's widow handed the testament over to be made public at the 13th Party Congress. In the event, it was read out at the Central Committee meeting before the Congress. Boris Bazhanov, then one of Stalin's secretaries, was there as Zinoviev spoke.
Вы все знаете, товарищи, что все, что нам завещал Ильич, мы поклялись выполнить, и мы это выполним. Но всякое слово Ильича для нас закон. Но мы счастливы констатировать, что то, чего боялся Ильич относительно нашего генерального секретаря ЦК, не случилось. Что наша работа в течение последних месяцев с генеральным секретарем была превосходной, и никаких трений в Центральном комитете нет. Все знали, что это неправда, потому что уже в полном разгаре была борьба за власть против Троцкого и вообще. И все очень потупили глаза. Сталин сидел на краю трибуны, лицом обращенным к окну, так что его члены Центрального комитета видеть его лицо не могли. Но я его очень хорошо видел, потому что я был на трибуне. У него было напряженное лицо, решалась его судьба. Останется он у власти или нет. Он молчал и смотрел в окно. Поставили вопрос на голосование сейчас же после этого, и большинство Центрального комитета проголосовало за то, чтобы Сталина оставить генеральным секретарем. Прений не было.
The speech worked. Stalin survived thanks to an arrangement he'd reached with Zinoviev on the left and Kamenev on the right. They had agreed to protect Stalin in exchange for Stalin's support in fighting Trotsky. Trotsky was a brilliant orator. Stalin could never beat him at that. But by seeming to represent Lenin's views, Stalin increasingly found an audience for what he had to say and people who believed in him. Abdurrahman Avtorkhanov was an early disciple.
Троцкий – это риторика. Бухарин – теория. Зиновьев – дешевая пропаганда. Сталин – концепция, логика, убедительные аргументы. Но свою внутреннюю концепцию он никому не давал. Это был его секрет.
Stalin's method was slow and insidious. As the party grew in the 1920s, its hold on the country grew. And by controlling appointments within the party, Stalin gradually acquired greater real power than his rivals. A countrywide network of party members owing allegiance only to Stalin lay at the end of a telephone.
И за то время, что он был генеральным секретарем, он успел понасажать своих людей. Людей, которые, в общем-то, ничего особенного собой не представляли, секретарями обкомов, крайкомов. В значительной степени уже были люди, ну, которые как-то были ему преданы, которые как-то его устраивали. Впоследствии он этих людей тоже посадил. Но в данный отрезок времени он все-таки как-то сумел обеспечить какой-то такой вот круг людей, которые ему доверяли и которые, сказать, считали, что он ведет правильную линию.
Yelizaveta Chomkina worked in a Leningrad shoe factory. She was accepted into the party in 1925.
И мы, конечно, Сталину верили, считали, что Сталин – это именно тот человек, который ведет правильно нашу страну. Ведь страна-то наша одна, в которой была революция, она же окружена со всех сторон недоброжелателями, как мы это понимали. И поэтому мы должны всячески крепить нашу страну.
While the party leaders struggled for power at the top, the party at the bottom grew. By 1925, there were 500,000 members. Doggedly ambitious for their country and for themselves, they were mostly ignorant and uneducated.
A party like that is best handled by an apparatus. It's interesting that the old Bolsheviks did not understand the apparatus. They preferred all of them to work in the government, not in the party. Stalin understood the party apparatus. He was, through his secretarial machinery, running this mass of the newcomers. And when it comes to the crunch, when Bolsheviks, group after group, become oppositions, he smashes them. Because he has a mass of people who don't understand what it's all about, listen to what they are told, and they eliminate one group of Bolsheviks after the other from this new party. When this is finished, 1929, this organization has nothing to do anymore with the historical thing that made this revolution.
The men who had made the revolution were in a hopeless position. In 1926, Trotsky joined Zinoviev and Kamenev to resist Stalin. But Stalin united with Bukharin and squeezed the others out of office. Trotsky was exiled from Russia, settling eventually in Mexico. His grandson believes Trotsky's character allowed Stalin to outmaneuver him.
Trotsky was a man of action, of the great battles of the revolutionary periods. But palace intrigues and plottings, that was not his role. Also, Stalin and Trotsky pursued absolutely opposite goals. Stalin was fighting for power. That was really his only and his main objective. And Trotsky was always fighting for the principles of Marxism and for the working class.
By 1926, the Soviet Union was being run by Stalin and Nikolai Bukharin. He was educated and cultured, the champion of the new economic policy since Lenin's death.
The boss is Stalin. The talker is Bukharin. Stalin does not have, as yet, any particular structured program of his own. It will be correct to say that he follows Bukharin's idea for a time, with corrections. But that's more or less all, because the reality of power now is the party apparatus and Bukharin is not in it.
But Stalin was backing Bukharin and the new economic policy. NEP, as it was known, was gradually restoring the countryside after the ravages of civil war, grain seizures and famine. Peasants were now free to trade their produce on the market. NEP let a little capitalism back into a country which had spent 4 years and millions of lives getting rid of it. Some party members watched the process with horror.
НЭП мы приняли нормально, хотя в партии были большие споры. Некоторые коммунисты были не согласны с линией Ленина и выходили из партии, потому что они не поддерживали НЭП. Но лично я, конечно, очень молодой тогда была, я лично НЭП приняла положительно.
Many peasants organized themselves into agricultural cooperatives, much praised by Lenin and now endorsed by Bukharin. For the peasants, the mid-20s were a time of hard work and high hopes.
Батько мій став там, де це можна стати, на підвищення на тракторі, і сказав промову, що як тепер люди ми будемо жити, з кожним роком буде прибавлятися техніка, фізичний труд буде поступово замінятися на легший, будемо придбавати машини і будемо керувати ними. Заасфальтуємо вулиці, проведемо в село електрику, побудуємо кам'яні будинки цегляні, побудуємо нову школу, лікарню. Ну, людям дуже було радісно.
More and more peasants were moving to the cities and into the factories. Bukharin believed that industrialization was essential for building socialism, but it didn't have to mean exploiting the workers and peasants. One picture summed up the challenge facing the people of the Soviet Union in that period. A boy of 12 saw it on a railway station wall, and it changed his life.
И передо мной открывалось будущее. Вот эта картина запала мне в душу. И мне захотелось быть этим самым мастеровым человеком, который разбивает цепи, опутывающие земной шар.
It was the dawning of a new industrial age. Alexander Avdienko went to the Donbass and got a job in a rolling mill. He had to turn half a ton of steel into a ribbon 200 meters long.
Она извивалась, как змея, она могла опутать тебя и сжечь в одно мгновение. Я вырос у заводского огня. Я время исчислял не по часам, а по заводскому гудку.
But amid the enthusiasms and aspirations of NEP Russia was the subdued but persistent presence of the secret police.
NEP wasn't democracy. NEP was a dictatorship. It was a political dictatorship on the part of a political party that had been through a ferocious civil war and that did have enemies. There had been a Western attempt to overthrow the Bolsheviks, intervention on the side of the White Army. Many Western governments still spoke of ridding themselves of this germ of Bolshevism. The sword could not be put down.
In 1926, at the funeral of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the old boss of the Cheka, Stalin was a leading pallbearer. He had maintained his links with the Cheka. He used it to obtain information about his enemies. Increasingly in the 1920s, and yet before Stalin ruled alone, the sword was turned not towards interfering foreigners, but against Soviet citizens. The Cheka, now called the GPU, had its headquarters in the Moscow building called the Lubyanka. Since the Civil War, the state had continued to round up its enemies, or those it thought were its enemies. Oleg Volkov was arrested in 1925 for refusing to spy on the Greek embassy in Moscow, where he was a translator.
Там не было ни подсудимого, никаких ни адвокатов. Эта коллегия ГПУ выносила приговор не выслушав никакого обвинения. Так что то, что давали материал следователи, это и служило основанием для приговора.
Oleg Volkov was to spend 27 years in prison camps. In 1928, he was sent to the Solovetsky Islands in the far north of Russia. For much of the year, the temperatures were 20 to 30 degrees below freezing. The 20,000 prisoners had a choice between hard labor and starvation. They were a mixed bag. Old supporters of the Tsar, common criminals, priests, political opponents of communism, men and women. Most were, like Oleg Volkov, entirely innocent. It was the start of a penal camp system which would spread across the Soviet Union. Discipline under the GPU guards was rigid. They ruled, unaccountable to anyone.
А потом я видел своими глазами, как, скажем, людей в одной рубахе, в нижнем белье выводили на улицу в мороз и запирали в пустой сарай. И там они, так сказать, я сам пережил тоже вот холодный карцер, неотапливаемый зимой. Так что режим был очень суровый, и особенно вот на лесозаготовках. Ведь доходило до того, что за невыполненный урок расстреливали, если вы не исполните норму.
From 1928, one category of the state's enemies dominated all others: the kulaks, or rich peasants. They were targeted by party propaganda, accused of hoarding grain, of keeping it from the factories and cities. It wasn't true, but it provided an excuse for the gradual failure of NEP to deliver. The quantity of grain on the market was now below 1913 levels. Industrial production was similar. Goods for the peasants to buy were scarce, costly, and of poor quality. They had little incentive to sell their grain.
New strategies had to be devised. And this moment is a moment of crisis, of course, because the industry is so big that it doesn't have enough to offer to the peasants. The peasants don't have goods. They don't want to sell grain. And in a country with little grain, little food, that is a crunch, that's a tough moment. It's a moment of truth. And everything this party has comes out in a battle for strategies. And this is not one strategy that's being proposed, several are being proposed.
Bukharin's plan was to give the economy more time, more leeway, less pressure. But Stalin's response was to send out the requisition squads to take the grain by force, just as Lenin had done 10 years before.
Once you began requisitioning grain, for example, you destroyed the peasants' confidence in the market. If you couldn't go back to the market, how could you get grain? Well, you'd use this fist, now you'd use the other fist. But suddenly this was generating civil war in the countryside. But wasn't it true that civil war was a form of class struggle? Maybe the kulak was resisting socialism. What would be socialism in the countryside? Collective farms.
Collectivization was Stalin's device for bringing socialism to the country and for imposing state control over agriculture. The peasants would be told what to do and when and how to do it. This would ensure the supply of food to cities and factories. The peasants had no choice. Join the collective farms or else. Stalin announced all-out compulsory collectivization in 1929. The kulaks would be, quite simply, eliminated as a class. Stalin had effectively killed NEP. Many in the party were relieved as the concession to capitalism ended.
Ленин дал, сам сказал, нет, пауза, передышка. Ну вот Сталин сказал, пауза кончилась, передышка кончилась, мы возвращаемся к социализму, коммунизму.
Bukharin fought for NEP with Prime Minister Alexei Rykov and trade union leader Mikhail Tomsky. But Stalin had stacked the Central Committee and the Politburo with his supporters. Bukharin and the others were outvoted and outmaneuvered.
The expulsion of Bukharin and the savage ideological attack on Bukharinism was meant to eliminate any conception that there had been an alternative to what was now underway in the country, namely all-out collectivization, or any Leninist legitimacy for it. And it was here, of course, that the cult emerged with its proclamation that there was a straight line with no possible detours or side roads or alternative roads from Lenin to Stalin, that he was the rightful heir and the only rightful heir.
The propaganda machine started the process of deifying Stalin on his 50th birthday in December 1929. By then, he was in effective control of the Soviet Union. All his old rivals were defeated. The men around him had backed him to win and now reaped the benefits. His policies of forced collectivization and rapid industrialization would dominate the country and its people. With the state power in his hands, Stalin embarked on a war against the nation. The Soviet Union would be changed utterly. This was to be a second revolution, bringing mass terror and man-made famine in its wake.
Найстрашніша ніч мені була, як батька забирали, бо я дуже плакала і зараз плачу. Не згадаю. Ну, і обличчя померлих однокласників, померлих родичів з голоду.
In the decade that followed, no one would be safe. Enemies of the people, Stalin believed, could be in every street, every office, every factory. People would live in constant fear of denunciation and arrest. The prison camp system would fill to bursting. The world turned upside down. Perhaps 20 million would die at the hands of their own state.
And the second part of Stalin is next Tuesday at 10:45.